I'm the Histrogeek, and I'm here to talk about monuments, because you didn't ask. The United States is going through a kind of fad of wiping out monuments to the Confederacy, the idols of the Confederacy, and some other monuments to highly questionable people. Despite what Fox News, Donald Trump, snowflakey white supremacists, and Southern apologists say, this was not the result of an evil PC conspiracy by Black Lives Matter, the Antifa, the alt-left, the Tooth Fairy, and the tenured faculty at Harvard. The movement actually began in 2015 by Republican Governor, now UN Ambassador, Nikki Haley of South Carolina, as a way to distract attention away from gun control after Dylan Roof killed 9 people at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. It was easier to remove the not actually national flag of a 150-year-old failure than to take on the NRA. Of course, a lot of people had wanted to remove these monuments, but were never able to mobilize enough power to get them removed. The times have changed. To further explain the controversy, I'm bringing in my balance-restoring contributor, NR Butt.
Hello, I'm Nat Racist Butt. The problem is that Confederate war monuments are important historical reminders of Southern heritage. Simply eliminating them is similar to Stalin eliminating un-people from the historical record. We shouldn't bow to political correctness and remove important reminders of our past. Sometimes the past is controversial, but that is no excuse to whitewash it, if you pardon the pun. We should remember the hundreds of thousands of Southerners who died defending their homes against people they saw as invaders. Most of these soldiers did not own slaves. Even more people lost their homes to Union atrocities late in the war. These monuments remember their sacrifice, an issue of great importance to many Southerners today. It is possible to admire people like Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson as military geniuses and genteel protectors of the South without defending slavery. We can admire for their courage and success, however brief, against the odds without bringing up the peculiar institution or the later history of race relations in the South.
Thank you, Miss Butt, for that insightful, if completely wrong-headed summary. You see, monuments are not history to be remembered, but important virtues represented by historical figures and or events. Since the time of the pharaohs, people didn't build monuments simply to show off the extraordinary, but to celebrate what society, or at least the powerful in society, think is important. And if those values change, then monuments get knocked over, or effaced, or fall into neglect until they collapse. It's a process as old as monuments themselves. The Romans actually had a legal procedure for this called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, where the names and images of traitors or nasty emperors were removed from public monuments. In more academic circles, this is known as the politics of memory. In the New Kingdom of Egypt, Thutmose III, or possibly his son Amenhotep II, scratched out the inscriptions of monuments built by his mother Hatshepsut, the only female pharaoh of ancient Egypt, to remove the idea of a ruling queen from public memory. And the removal stood because later pharaohs and priests were still scandalized by the idea that a woman had ruled their country, plus Thutmose III was an impressive pharaoh in his own right. All this scratching out of leaders' names didn't remove them from history. One leader who was condemned to damnatio memoriae by the Roman Senate was Lucius Aelius Sejanus, executed for conspiring against Tiberius Caesar and never rehabilitated. Although all of his monuments were destroyed, no Roman historian describing the period ignored Sejanus. He wasn't described in euphemisms like he was Voldemort. He was written about extensively, and his name survives among people who read and discuss such things. Sejanus was even a character in the novel and later BBC series I, Claudius, played by some obscure actor in a bad wig you've probably never heard of. So there's a big difference between removing someone from monuments and removing them from history more generally. The history shown in monuments is always an idealized one. Every monument shows someone or group of someones who is clever and brave and self-sacrificing and usually successful in the end. If monuments alone were history, then the past would have been some sort of fairy tale or action movie. History is often written by winners, but monuments are almost always built by winners, or at least with the tacit approval of the winners. Although Miss Butt may deny it, everyone knows this. People talk about removing history, but if someone took down a monument to President Polk, or President Hayes, or General Winfield Scott, would there really be a major uproar? We don't build monuments to people we don't think are important, who don't have something valuable that the powers that be admire. And nobody cares if we replace a monument to Hamilton Fisk with a large planter of petunias. However, take down a monument to John Kennedy, and more than a few people will be somewhat miffed. In the South, you can see this very clearly in who gets monuments made to them. Among the chief generals of the Army of Northern Virginia, you can find monuments to Lee, Jeb Stuart, Stonewall Jackson, or even A.P. Hill. But who has barely any monuments in the South? Just one in his own hometown, as far as I could tell. James Longstreet, commander of Lee's First Corps, the man who smashed Union forces at Fredericksburg, the man who tried to stop Pickett's charge, the man who saved the day at the Battle of the Wilderness, and who told Lee to stand firm if Grant didn't give good terms at Appomattox. And why doesn't General Longstreet have bases and statues in his honor? Because he rejected the idea of the lost cause, criticized Lee, who, it might be remembered, lost the war, commanded African American troops against the Crescent City White League in New Orleans, and worked with Republican administrations, beginning with his West Point friend, Ulysses Grant. So Longstreet doesn't represent the virtues, the values of the people putting up these statues. Never mind his wartime accomplishments. Never mind the soldiers who fought and died under the command of Old Pete. Never mind that he was right about Gettysburg and Reconstruction. Nope. He's treated like a traitor because he dared to stop fighting the war after 1865 and rejoin the Union in a serious way. So Longstreet gets nothing, while a widely despised and almost completely unsuccessful Confederate general, Braxton Bragg, has the largest U.S. Army base in the world named after him. That, ladies and gentlemen, is real revisionist history. It's made some rounds in the interweb tubes that nearly all Confederate monuments were built between 1888 and 1918. There were a second round of memorials, mostly in the names of schools, starting in the completely arbitrary year of 1954. In this first case, segregationists had just completed their takeover of the power structure in the South from their rivals, the Reconstruction Republicans. In the second case, they were reopening resistance to the federal challenge begun by Brown versus the Board of Education. These were not coincidentally the eras of extreme racial terrorism and overt white supremacy. The monuments were largely symbols of the unreconstructed South, the South where slavery was only removed at gunpoint after an epic struggle, where the federal government feared the South, and where white supremacy would remain for all time. And the monuments reminded anyone who opposed the social order of who really was in charge. That's why you don't see monuments to pro-Reconstruction Southerners like James Longstreet, or Southern Unionists like George Thomas of Virginia, who incidentally fought against Longstreet at the Battle of Chickamauga, or pro-Union integrationist guerrillas like Newton Knight of Mississippi, or Confederate veteran turned civil rights and labor advocate, as well as socialist martyr Albert Parsons of Texas, and those are just a few politically incorrect white people who got ignored. Unsurprisingly, there were barely any monuments in the South to African American troops until after the 1990 movie Glory reminded everyone that black troops existed. Over 90,000 African Americans from just the Confederate States served in federal uniform, not to mention roughly 200,000 African Americans from southern states who worked for the Union Army as free volunteer civilians and not as rented labor gifted by a plantation lord. But Histrogeek, I can hear you say, white supremacists don't build monuments to African Americans. Well, actually they do. Loyal slaves have several monuments to them. The powers that be in the South could support memorials for African Americans, but only the right kind of African Americans. You see what I mean about fairy tales and values. The reality that almost 300,000 African Americans from the South served the Union Army directly, often under crap conditions and facing overt racism from the Union side, was not important. Especially not important is the fact that tens of thousands of African Americans went out of their way, often really out of their way, against potential re-enslavement or summary execution to serve under the aforementioned crap racist conditions if it meant a chance to escape slavery permanently. Forget them, please. Instead, the monument makers wanted to remember the loyal slaves. Removing the Confederate monuments is an effort to remove the celebration of the deadliest enemy ever faced by the U.S. Army, the most successful terrorists in U.S. history, and the enslavement and disenfranchisement of millions of men and women in the service of an idea so foul that even its greatest partisans today give themselves alt names to hide their beliefs. Celebrating treason is wrong. Celebrating slavery is wrong. Celebrating white supremacy is wrong. And why in 2017 do I need to explain that? It's not eliminating Southern history, or the memory of the Civil War, or spitting on the graves of men who fought and died to defend their homes. As far as the last, the rich planters who whipped up a war they were unlikely to win, in defense of an institution rejected by most Western opinion at the time, spat on those soldiers' graves before they were even dug. The planters are the ones whose monuments are and need to be taken down, because they don't deserve to be celebrated, and neither does their cause. Removing Confederate war monuments says the South doesn't celebrate treason, terrorism, slavery, and racism because no Americans celebrate treason, terrorism, slavery, and racism. I mean, we don't, right? I'm the Histrogeek, and I know you didn't ask, but maybe you should have.